Okay, Todd, I think we both have voices that project, but we learned that we need to use the final fall archaeology lecture series. Tonight I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Todd Braje, who is an archaeologist, Irvine Chair of Anthropology, and Associate Curator at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. He's formerly a professor at San Diego State University and Humboldt State University. Todd earned a master's degree from the University of Florida in 2003, and then a PhD from the University of Oregon in 2007. You haven't been back since. Amazing. Yes, he's a duck, and he's been a student, a colleague, and a friend of mine for many years. Todd has had a truly remarkable, productive career that makes a former mentor very proud. He's edited several volumes of the Journal of California and Great Basin Anthropology and co-edited several more of the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology. He's published 4 books and more than 100 journal articles and book chapters. His research focuses on the archaeology and historical ecology of maritime cultures. He's worked in California, Oregon, Florida, Mexico, Belize, and the Solomon Islands. His research interests are impressively eclectic, ranging from historical archaeology, including Chinese abalone middens on the California's Channel Islands, which were largely ignored for decades, including by myself, until Todd came along. The peeping of the Americas, including the Kelp Highway and Mangrove Highway hypotheses, the Anthropocene and human impacts on ancient environments, and much more. As you can see from his title tonight, Todd's going to talk about what we currently know and don't know about the peopling of the Americas. Please welcome Dr. Todd Braje back to Eugene, Oregon.
Thanks, John, and for that great introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be back here. I mean, one of the great things about my job is I get to fly around the country and the world and give talks, and I have been anxiously awaiting the opportunity to come back here. This was a place, I see a lot of my mentors here, a lot of the people that really helped define my career, and it's really a delight to be here. And 11 years ago was the last time I was at this museum, and it has just grown in such a tremendous place. So it's really great to see all the hard work by all the folks here and all your support too, for the support of the museum. So thank you for that. I still wear duck pajamas, as does my 2-year-old son. So I bleed green like the rest of you. So I'm going to talk today. So John asked me to talk about this 130,000-year-old archaeological site that was discovered and published in Nature in April 2017, right outside in San Diego. And so, you have here on campus some of the world's leading experts on people in the New World, both in the Department of Anthropology, here at the museum. So what I don't want to do is give you a talk that you might have heard before, specifically about the people in the New World. And so I'm going to frame where we're at in research about the earliest migrations into the New World. We're going to talk about this site. We're going to deconstruct it a little bit. I'm going to range a little bit widely and talk about science itself and epistemology and how we know what we know. And then at the end, I'm going to show you some of our own research that's going on to enter into these issues, and then bring it back to museums at the end. But I was a middle school teacher for a couple years before I went off to graduate school at Florida. And one of the things that I learned to do in my teaching at the university for 10 years was to give folks a pop quiz before I started, right? to see what they know. So here's the question. Who were the first Americans? All right, was it A, Clovis, Mammoth and Mastodon hunters who walked down an Icefree Corridor? B, pre-Clovis ancestors following Pacific shorelines? C, people unrelated to Clovis? D, what the heck is Clovis? Did that? All right, so this is the participation point of the lecture. So A, okay, a few A's. B, all right, lots of B's. C, Yeah, don't confuse me here. Well, you know, what about D? Anyone want to admit it? All right, we got some folks that will admit it. All right, so you all failed, right? So now I know you know nothing, right? Because the answer is we just don't know. Sorry, trick question. We just don't know. So how did we get here? How did we get to the point where many of you were probably in school, heard a specific story about the people in the New World, and how is it that I can stand up here and tell you now that we don't know who were the first Americans and how they got here? So let's back up, right? So claims for antiquity in the New World, great antiquity in the New World, have really always been met with skepticism. This goes back to sort of the first questions about who Native Americans were and how they got here. And until the 1920s, most leading scholars thought that Native American history reached back only 4,000 years. Of course, it's a lot easier to dispossess people of their land. If you suggest people haven't been here very long and this was a part of colonialism. But this became known as the short chronology, and up till the 1920s, this was the story. It goes back no more than about 4,000 years. That myth was shattered basically overnight in 1924 with a single site. And this was the discovery of unequivocal human artifacts in direct association with extinct Ice Age fauna, right? Here's a Folsom site. This is a fluted, clearly human-made projectile points embedded in the ribs of this extinct form of bison that was around at least 10,000 years ago. So essentially overnight, the chronology of the people in the New World was pushed back some 6,000 years, right? It was a watershed moment in our understanding of the people in the New World. And for the next 6 to 7 decades, the story about who the first Americans were started to materialize. More sites were found with these fluted, generally large, big game hunting points that were found from sea to shining sea in North America, something equivalent to the south. But the first entrance into the New World, the first migrants became known as Clovis, based on the Clovis type site near Clovis, New Mexico. They were these large, fluted projectile points, presumably used to hunt the Ice Age fauna, some of which you can see outside the museum right now, right? The mammoths outside the museum. And much of the data seemed to fit, right? These sites tended to date between 13,500 years ago. They go away, Clovis goes away about 12,900 years ago, and we get other sort of fluted technology, Paleo-Indian cultures later as these large Ice Age mammals go extinct and people sort of change their adaptation. Right? And this seemed to work for a long time, and this story was built by prominent scholars for decades, right? Who received funding, who wrote their dissertations, got accolades at universities and academic institutions around the country and around the world for this, what became known as the Clovis first story. And again, and of course, they walked across an Icefree Corridor sometime during the last glacial maximum, across the Bering Land Bridge, down an Icefree Corridor, and into the New World, right? So here's the story, this Clovis first story materialized. So Clovis was regarded as the first culture in the New World. The point of origin was presumed to be Siberia, with passage into Alaska sometime during the last glacial maximum. As we came out of the last glacial maximum, the world warmed, ice sheets retreated, an Icefree Corridor opened up, and people followed game down into the New World and spread from sea to shining sea, right? This passage opened up, this Icefree Corridor opened up about 13,500 years ago, and this became the baseline for human occupation, human origins, and became known as the Clovis Barrier, right? The earliest sites in the New World. Claims for pre-Clovis sites, stuff that was older than 13,500 years ago, popped up. And what would happen is those folks who wrote their dissertations, who found these Clovis sites, who worked on this story, would descend on you. Not literally, but potentially in the literature, right? At academic conferences, they became known as the Clovis Mafia. Scary, right? And many of the pre-Clovis sites were quickly dismissed for a variety of problems. They didn't fit for one reason or another, right? And so this story started to materialize and became the story of the peopling of the Americas for decades. Again, that changed, maybe not overnight, maybe I'm overselling a little bit, but it changed fairly suddenly with the discovery of a single site. This is Monte Verde. It's in the southern sort of tip of Chile here. It's a paleo-coastal site. It's not quite on the coast, but it's near the coast. But this site was excavated by Tom Dillehay and colleagues and was dated to 14,500 years ago, 1,000 years before Clovis, presumably before the Icefree Corridor was open, and 16,000 kilometers from Alaska. Right? So everything changes. And clearly, human-made artifacts, human-made technologies in this beautifully preserved, semi-wet site that had great organic preservation, and a radiocarbon dates on a variety of materials that really nailed down this chronology of certainly older than Clovis, between 14,000 and 14,500 years ago. So here are some of my favorite from the site. These are wooden pegs, part of tent pegs with hide still attached to them, and one source of the radiocarbon dates. Really spectacular archaeology. Right, now, this, of course, was at a time when the Clovis Mafia was always lurking, right? And Dillehay did something really smart, right? He got money, and he invited the Clovis Mafia down to Monte Verde, right? And here they are, that scary group of people, or at least some of them, right? So, and he invited them down, and he showed them all the artifacts, let them look at the stratigraphy, let them look at the archaeology, and inspect the site, and it was open to that criticism. He knew it was coming, and he got out in front of it, and to a person, at least when they were down there, they agreed, this is real, the radiocarbon dates look good, everything has changed. It's a shift that happened nearly overnight. And they all accepted it. Then they got home and one person backed out. So skepticism remained, right? At least by a small group of people. There continued to be skepticism about Monte Verde. The biggest skeptic was Vance Haynes, who went down to inspect the site. He retracted later his acceptance of Monte Verde, wouldn't agree with the findings. So I don't want to make it sound like there's a consensus. There's still controversy, right? There's still argument, but for the most part, the scientific community found Monte Verde to be acceptable or convincing, and we entered this sort of paradigm shift in the peopling of the New World. And since then, a handful of archaeological sites, here's some of them, pre-Clovis archaeological sites have been found around North America and identified that date to 14 to 16,000 years old. Some of them are more controversial than others. This is not an exhaustive list, but again, sort of a handful. As things shifted with Monte Verde, we started to realize we needed to look for that new story and better understand how and when people first arrived, because Clovis first was no longer viable. And in fact, right here at the University of Oregon has been one of the epicenters of trying to better understand this story. You can go to the exhibit halls and see Dennis Jenkins. Here's a picture of him here. And his work at Paisley Cave and work at a variety of other places around the Great Basin that have shown, even here in Oregon, we have sites that are pre-Clovis in age. This is Dennis holding a human coprolite. Dennis isn't here, so I can tell you, he's Dr. Poop, right? This is human poop that's dated to pre-Clovis, right? Spectacular. right? Really great stuff in the caves there. So again, this handful of sites pop up, and since this sort of collapse of Clovis first, other sort of studies about, related to this story have shown that things like the Icefree Corridor either wasn't open or wasn't viable in time for people to walk down it to create these PreClovis sites, right? So here's a paper that was published in 2016 suggesting that we don't see flora and fauna in the Icefree Corridor. If you're going to walk down that Icefree Corridor, basically from Alaska through Canada down into North America, you probably need something to hunt and eat, right? And so you can't do that until there's flora and fauna occupying that area. And that didn't seem to be until well after even Clovis shows up in North America. In genetic studies of bison, north of the Icefree Corridor and south of the Icefree Corridor, there doesn't seem to be genetic mixing of these groups until at least 13,400 years ago. So again, all these sort of challenges that show us multiple lines of evidence that show us this Clovis first model is no longer viable. And since then, this has opened Pandora's box. And archaeologists and other scientists have been scrambling to come up with hypotheses and test those hypotheses about how and when people first arrived. And that's where we're at right now. We're at this moment in archaeology when our old stories no longer work and we're trying to figure out the new story. And in that context, in April 2017, I was at San Diego State at the time. I just moved up to the California Academy 6 months ago. Right in my backyard, the Cerruti Mastodon site was published in Nature, one of the most prominent journals in the world, that suggested a 130,000-year-old occupation in San Diego by humans. And it took the world by storm. I think that's safe to say. It took the news media by storm. I was actually at a conference in Australia, and I was getting these news feeds about this article and this finding. It hit all the major news outlets. My wife even told me that they made a joke about it, or they referenced it during SportsCenter. So you've made an impact if it's on SportsCenter, right? They're talking about basketball and they say, oh, that 130,000-year-old Mastodon site in San Diego, right? So it gained this massive attention. And before we look at the site, I just want to say I'm partly invited here to celebrate the construction of the mammoths. This is a mastodon we're talking about. Mastodons are not mammoths. They're a little bit different, a little shorter at the shoulder, longer overall, a little bit larger, different diet. So similar to mammoths and what you see out in the courtyard, but not quite. So back to the mastodon here, right? So what did they find at this site? Well, this site was discovered 25 years ago during highway construction in San Diego, and it wasn't published until 2017. And part of the problem that the authors suggest is we were stuck in this Clovis first paradigm, right? And no one would listen. Now is a time where people would listen. So what they found was a mammoth bone, or mastodon bones. It seemed to be processed and smashed, both large and small. Femoral heads of that mastodon rested one right next to the other. Anvil and hammer tools used to knock these bones open and extract marrow, and kinds of fractures on those bones that can only happen on fresh bones, right? That this animal died, either killed by humans or died naturally, and then quickly after that death were smashed open by humans. And their claim is that this can only be done, these spiral fractures can only be done with human agency. Right? And this is the stone tool assemblage from the Cerruti Mastodon site we're talking about. Here's two of the 6 stone tools. An anvil and hammer. Again, sort of they point to wear patterns on these tools that suggest that they were used by humans to process these. right? And then a tusk of this mastodon driven into the ground right near the processing area, presumably as a marker, right? So here's the reconstruction on this sort of floodplain, the bones and tools scattered around, the marker shown, and then these humans or hominids in the background that you can't see very well, right? And this was the evidence, right? 130,000 years old. And this pushes back then the chronology of the people into the world, essentially overnight, 115,000 years, right? So it took us 6-7 decades, push it back 1,000 years. And then a couple years after that, or a decade perhaps, to push it back another 115,000 years. Now, this site is not unique, right? And I'll give you a couple examples. There have been claims of sites of great antiquity in both North and South America for decades, right? This is nothing new. Perhaps the most famous is the Calico Hill site in California. I know this site well because when I lived in San Diego and I get in my car and I need to get to the One-Armed Bandit in Las Vegas and do a little gambling, this site's on the way. That was a joke. My wife did not gamble. So this was a site that was proposed to be 200,000 years old in Southern California. And Louis Leakey, the famous Louis and Mary Leakey, the godfather and godmother of paleoanthropology in Africa, who discovered many hominid species and defined much of what we know about hominid evolution in Africa. Louis Leakey came out and said, these are human tools, these are chopper tools. And they found something on the order of 60,000 of these tools, right? So, and in fact, when geologists and other archaeologists started to do a reanalysis of this site, it still took 10 years, a decade, to sort of debunk this site. They said this is actually a high energy area, a floodplain, where you're getting these rocks banging together in the creation of what we call geofacts. Things created by nature that can look a lot like artifacts. So these do look a lot like stone tools you might find with Homo erectus sites in Africa, but they seem to be created by nature. Nature can be very tricky. Another site, and I can give you other examples. Here's another site from the East Coast. This is the Topper site. It's excavated by Al Goodyear. There's a clear Clovis occupation of fluted points at this site. It is a real archaeological site. But buried deep down, Goodyear has claimed a 40 to 50,000 year old occupation from radiocarbon dates he has on charcoal on the basal component of this site that he says shows deep human antiquity on the east coast of the United States. It's never been published. These 40 to 50,000 year old dates have never been confirmed. The reason we know about them is a press release, right? So it hasn't stood through scrutiny. And again, this is just the second of a handful of examples, or several dozen examples that I can give you. But it's this kind of thing in the historical sciences and then archaeology seems to happen quite a bit, right? There seems to be the historical sciences seem in some way to be open to wild speculation, right? That we don't have to play by the rules of science. We can say, well, why couldn't people have been here 200,000 years ago? And it's a fair question, right? They certainly could have. But did they? What's the evidence? And we get publications like this. This is Forbidden Archaeology. It is written in 1993. It's something like a 900-page tome, really well researched about how there's been a systematic overlook of deep antiquity of humans around the world that extends back to 65 million years. Packaged as science, largely pseudoscience, but the argument being that we are blinded because we're stuck in a paradigm and we're not willing to see the evidence. All right. Well, let's go back to the Mastodon site, the Cerruti Mastodon site. What are the major problems? Well, there's been a number of published. I've led a publication to lay out some of this. Many other scholars have responded. So let's go over the 4 major problems. One, the first major problem is there were no anatomically modern humans really outside of Africa. There were migrations out of Africa. They seemed to head back, but really until about 70,000 years ago. So if Cerruti Mastodon site was occupied by humans, this means they would be hominids, archaic Homo sapiens, not anatomically modern humans. We have no evidence of anatomically modern or pre-anatomically modern humans or anatomically modern humans in the areas in time to occupy this site. And in fact, the earliest sites we have in the far northeast that date between about 30 and 35,000 years ago, and as you can see here. And so we don't have anatomically modern humans, and the connection between archaics in this area in time is very dubious. The assumption that this was archaics becomes even more problematic when we think about routes. 130,000 years ago, an Icefree Corridor route into the New World, down into California and San Diego, was not open. So the authors have suggested it was a maritime migration into the New World. Well, the problem with that is there is no evidence of sophisticated open ocean maritime voyaging prior to anatomically modern humans, and really prior to 50 to 55,000 years ago, much later than the occupations at the proposed occupations at the Cerruti Mastodon site. I will say, for the archaeologists in the room who are wrinkling their brows, going, I heard about a 130,000-year-old site on Crete, on the island of Crete, by potentially Homo erectus populations or archaics. Very controversial, but I would suggest that voyaging out to Crete is very different than cold open ocean voyaging around the North Pacific, right? So another problem. The third problem is that we can actually go to sites with Mastodon and Mammoth bones that are clearly not human-made and see the same kind of spiral fractures that the authors claim cannot be made without human agency. And in fact, so this is the Englewood Mammoth site in Maryland, dates to 24,000 years ago. No evidence of humans. Spiral fractures probably caused by trampling of these animals by their recently dead, right? Their own trampling of these bones. And we can find mammoth sites that go back hundreds of thousands of years with spiral fractures. So this idea we don't find this stuff without human agency is actually not very accurate. Major problem number 4, where are all the sites between 130,000 years old and 15,000 years old? Why such a massive gap? To sort of contextualize this, we know Australia was colonized about 50,000 years ago by maritime, anatomically modern humans intentionally voyaging into Australia. Here's what the record of early Pleistocene sites in Australia looks like. Not a lot of them, but they're spread across Australia. We have a variety of sites that we can look for. It's not an N of 1. It's not 1, right? The authors suggest that the occupants who made the Mastodon site, the Cerruti site, must have died out and left no other evidence. Here's Australia and Pleistocene and Holocene sites added in, right? So what we should expect from colonization up through time is an increase in the archaeological sites that we see on the landscape. That is not what we see between Cerruti Mastodon site and other widely accepted pre-Clovis sites in North America. So since the publication of this paper in 2017, it splashed the news. There's been this widespread criticism, and a variety of articles have come out in the public media, sort of taking this debate on. And some or many of the articles are kind of characteristic of this LA Times article that was recently published that I talked to this reporter about, but this was the title of the article. Archaeology is blood sport. Archaeology is blood sport. Focusing on the idea that we somehow, archaeologists, are all just like egomaniacs arguing about what they view as the record, and stuck in paradigms and unable to see the forest through the trees. So one of the quotes from this article was this: "Entrenched views are hard to shift for researchers who have built a reputation on them." And I read that and I started to think, right, that when the Clovis first model was in place, I mean, and I give talks about the collapse of Clovis first. This is kind of how I characterize it. In some ways, people were entrenched in these views and had a hard time thinking outside of this Clovis first model until Monte Verde, right? And so the question becomes, is that what's happening here? Am I stuck? Are many other archaeologists and critics, skeptics, stuck in some model about pre-Clovis, although we don't know when people first arrived? So are we stuck? Are we entrenched? Is that what's going on? Now, I have a brother who's much smarter than me, who got his a PhD in astrophysics from Stanford, and so I feel slightly comfortable giving you an example from astronomy and astrophysics to sort of characterize this. But let's just think about the process of science, right? And let's use one of the hard sciences to think about this, not those historical sciences that seem to be always up for debate. Let's talk about astronomy. So Eratosthenes was the director of the Great Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, and he was the first to devise a way to prove that the Earth wasn't flat. And he heard rumors that on the summer solstice in a town in southern Egypt, that there were no shadows cast on upright sticks or columns. But at the same time, in Alexandria to the north, there were shadows cast. And he applied mathematics and said the only explanation, reasonable explanation for this, is the Earth is spherical, right? It's round, right? And that became sort of the model for re-understanding the surface of the Earth, and it is curved. Ptolemy built on this, right? And he was an astronomer, Greco-Roman astronomer. He elaborated on this spherical Earth hypothesis, and he proposed that the sun, moon, and planets and stars circled the Earth, right? Planetary motion was the problem, and he solved it with the geocentric model that suggested that Earth is the center of the universe, all the planets and stars rotate around it. The observations are confusing because sometimes during the year certain planets are brighter than at other times, and so you had to have this sort of not only going around the Earth, but this extra complexity of another loop of the planets, right? So they're on this, they're on wheels attached to a larger wheel, right? And so added this extra complexity, but this became the model of planetary motion for 1,500 years. It worked, right? The observations that people were making could be explained effectively with this model. Enter Occam's Razor. This is William of Occam in the 14th century. Is a theologian. He came up with the law of parsimony, what's become known as Occam's Razor, and he said nature prefers simplicity. And we shouldn't use more assumptions than the minimum needed to explain observations. This is a foundation of hypothesis building, of theory building in science. It has become part and parcel of what all scientists do, whether they're historical scientists like archaeologists or astronomers or others. And it helps us shave off those concepts or variables or constructs that aren't needed to effectively explain phenomena. So Copernicus comes along, right, 1,500 years later, and he tried to solve the problem upon planetary motion with a simpler model. And that simpler model is that the Earth revolves around the sun, right? And the planets revolve around the sun. To explain planetary motion, from there you get Galileo and round planets, Newton, gravity and inertia, Kepler, planetary, and on, right? The point is that we build on science in a processual manner, right? Science builds on knowledge in the past, and we can't disregard everything we know to make something fit the way we want it to. The historical sciences, archaeology is the same as any of the sciences. We adhere to this. Right, this Thomas Kuhn, he wrote the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He talked about science works with paradigms. They're established, accepted models of the observed universe. This is normal science. We use data just like Clovis first. It seemed to fit all the data. It worked. It became the paradigm. And then something shifted that, right? That Monte Verde and a variety of other sites shifted that paradigm, and it's edge walkers, people thinking sort of outside of the proverbial box, right? To shift what we think we know and move the paradigm. However, in all of these cases, we need people to think creatively, and many of the folks that I interacted here with when I was a graduate student that really helped me are some of the most creative thinkers that I've ever been around. And we need this creative speculation to think about the past and the present and explain phenomena. But all those scientists that I learned from, we have to understand that science has rules of evidence. So it creates the best scientists are creative, and they're and they think differently than sort of everyone else, but they still follow the rules of evidence. Let me give you one more example from astronomy. This is like watching some Nova channel, and I thought this was really cool. String theorists are betting that extra dimensions, other than the four we already know, including time, do exist. In fact, the equations that describe superstring theory require a universe with no fewer than 10 dimensions. But even physicists who spend all day thinking about extra spatial dimensions have a hard time describing what they might look like or how we might approach them, approach and understanding them. That's always been the case, perhaps always will. So even though they can describe these they know these multiple dimensions must exist, they're still bound by the rules of science to try to figure this out, right? So we should be approaching archaeology and historical sciences in much the same way. So what's what? Where are we at, right? Given all that, what do we know about the people into the New World? Well, we know that Clovis wasn't the first. Still the earliest well-documented cultural horizon in North America. There were several pre-Clovis migrations that were possible. And there's a variety of evidence, including archaeological, linguistic, genetic, hominid, migrations, the human odyssey, that are all starting to coalesce on this idea that the earliest migrations into the New World was probably post 20,000 years ago, a post 20,000 years ago migration. And the Pacific case is a growing strong. And I think my research has focused on the Pacific case as the most likely colonization, earliest colonization route into the New World that helps explain the pre-Clovis occupations in the Americas. And John Erlandson has written a lot about this, that one of the ideas is that if you think about walking from Alaska down to southern Chile, think about the mountains and the deserts and the landscapes that you would have to adapt to, right? The resources that you would have to find and exploit that would be quite different along this route. In fact, ecological evidence suggests they're the same kind of kelp forest resources, a little break in the tropics for productive mangrove environments that may have been a corridor for migrations into the New World. And it seems like that migration, if the Icefree Corridor was closed, if the Pacific coast may have offered a really excellent corridor for human migrations into the New World that may help explain the earliest colonization of the Americas. And in fact, we've documented recently the connection of stemmed point technologies that ring the North Pacific. They're a little bit different, right? They're not all quite the same, but these large, generally similar stem point technologies that go from the Ryukyu Islands, Japanese islands, around the North Pacific and down into South America, that may be some evidence of an early coastal migration. Now, the New World stuff, for the most part, isn't older than Clovis. It's post-Clovis, maybe barely into Clovis, right? Now, why might that be? We don't have currently any pre-Clovis sites on the Pacific coast of the Americas, right? A major gap. Well, one of the challenges might be, this is where I live, and 14,000 years ago, I could walk from my house on dry land, might be a little muddy, out to the Farallon Islands, right? So when we think about the coast and coastal landscapes, that these have just fundamentally changed since the last glacial maximum. 5% of the world's ocean water was caught up into glacial ice sheets and high altitude regions. That lowered global sea levels made the paleo coastlines in many places around the Pacific now deep underwater, right? As the world warmed and this ice melted and the water retreated back into the oceans, right? So incredible coastal change. You add that to coastal erosion and the dynamic processes that change the coast, about hurricane season and all that, and the Cascadia subduction zone. I won't talk about that too much around here. It's a little scary. But incredible potential for erosion and change along the world's coastlines. So one of the things that I'm doing at the Academy, and one of the projects that we have with a variety of institutions, including here at the University of Oregon, is to try to better understand these submerged paleo coastlines along the Pacific coast. We know, I think this is true, we know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the submerged coastlines along the Pacific. Right? We know virtually nothing, and this is, again, I think it's true, the largest project to start to better understand these submerged coastlines. We are starting really from ground zero to map these coastlines. So the first part, we started our work on the Northern Channel Islands of Southern California. These are off of sort of just north of LA, 4 offshore islands that converged into one super island during the last glacial maximum. We're using a variety of data sets to try to map those submerged coastlines and what they look like. We have sites that are 13,000 years old on the island, and 12,000 years old, very old archaeology, and still we're missing something on the order of 75% of Santa Rosa since the last glacial maximum has been submerged. So we're finding these really early sites, and we have a very small percentage of what this landscape looked like when people were potentially there. And so we're doing work like work off of boats to map these submerged coastlines with new sonar technology, chirp technology that maps not just the sea floor, but the deeper stratigraphy, what those sediments look like, and penetrate through those sediments, and just try to understand those submerged landscapes and identify things like this. This is a spot in between 2 of the modern islands today that show evidence of a submerged, intact estuarine sediments that may have been perfect for people to occupy during pre-Clovis times. Here's another one. This is sort of what we're trying to find and track. It's a paleo channel. We know people like fresh water. They set up archaeological sites along fresh water sources. On the edges, you can see this funny sort of area on the edges of this paleo channel where these drainages drained into the ocean. The marine geologist tells us those are high amplitude reflectors. When those have been found in similar work in the Gulf Coast, on the Gulf Coast, at least one has turned out what seems to be a submerged shell midden. So I don't like to say it's a shell midden, but it might be a shell midden, right? And the only way to find out then is to go and sample those landscapes, those estuarine deposits, those things that look like shell middens. And so in February 2018, we did a large-scale coring operation, gathered 26 cores from 4 different locations around the Channel Islands to try to sample these and figure out, are these deposits there? Are what we think these landscapes look like? Is that indeed what they look like? Are these shell middens? Are they not? I can't tell you any answers. They're all these cores are sitting up at Oregon State University, and we are scheduling 7 different institutions to converge on Oregon State and open the cores and figure out what we have. So I've got no results for you. But also the exciting thing is we're doing as part of this project, we're doing a very similar thing right here on the Central Oregon coast, right? The Cedar Banks is a massive submerged paleo landscape that we've done sonar work and collected 38 cores, again, that are sitting at Oregon State waiting to be open, where we've identified paleo channels and deposits that may tell us about potentially some of the earliest archaeology or landscapes of the Pacific coast. So this is Ken Fetter, who's an archaeologist on the East Coast, I forgot which university, but he writes a lot about epistemology and science and how we know what we know. And what I'll leave you with is, one of the things I want to leave you with is that Clovis first model. We might have been stuck in that Clovis first model for longer than we maybe should have. There may be lessons to be learned for why we weren't looking, why we weren't thinking outside of the box, how funding tends to be directed towards people sort of doing normal research or normal science stuff that's accepted, right? And so there are certainly lessons to be learned, but I'll say the process of science worked, right? We need to be critical. We need to be skeptical. We need to view claims with skepticism. And when we find appropriate sites that meet the standard of evidence, that's when things shift. And that's what happened with the death of Clovis first, death of that model. Whether the Cerruti Mastodon site is real or not, to me, that's not quite the question. Does it have the evidence to topple everything we thought we knew from a variety of different interdisciplinary perspectives about the peopling of the New World? And the answer is no, right? It's just not enough. Even if it is real, it's just not enough, right? To fill the Clovis void. So what do we need, right? We need to continue to find definitive evidence for pre-Clovis occupations in the New World and understand the patterning between these sites. They shouldn't be complete oddities, right? We should be skeptical when we see cases of one that seem to be outside of everything we thought we knew. The strongest evidence are going to be artifacts of unequivocal human construction. Cerruti Mastodon didn't have that. Nature could have created that stuff. And radiocarbon ages or some sort of radiometric dating in excess of 13.5 or pre-Clovis in age in direct association with those artifacts. We need to combine multiple lines of evidence. It's not just archaeology. We're working with a variety of disciplines and a variety of scientists to combine multiple lines of evidence to understand the story. We need to connect New World and Old World counterparts, right? This stuff has to come from somewhere. We need to trace, we need to connect the dots and understand early New World sites and their Old World counterparts. And for me, for my money, we are in the midst of the most exciting time in Paleo-Indian studies since the beginning of the 20th century, right? There's no better time to think about this stuff because it's wide open. But we need to continue to follow the rules of science. We need to continue to work in interdisciplinary teams to sort this new story out of Paleo-Indian origins. Let me just leave you with one final thought, because I got to leave you with a museum thought here. This is a picture of our Human Odyssey display in the African Hall at the Academy of Sciences. I love it because it's one of the places we feature anthropology and archaeology on our public floor. And I'm showing it to you because one of the things that we pride ourselves on at the Academy is that we produce science, right? We have science producers, we have curators who do science, and that gets translated on the public floor. This was created by the anthropology, the Irvine Chair of Anthropology before me, who I took over for. He studied hominid evolution in Africa, and this this tells the story of his research. That's what's going on here at the University of Oregon. I was just blown away going through the exhibits on the focus on sort of research that's coming out of Oregon and coming out of the museum and out of anthropology and the other departments on campus. It's a really special place. But we also need to think about not just telling our stories of science and what we're finding, but in the 21st century with things like the Cerruti Mastodon site and the way the public is understanding or misunderstanding science, we need to start thinking, and one of the things we're doing at the Academy is starting to think deeply on how do we teach science process, right? It's not enough just to tell the public the results we get, but how do we teach science process? So I'll leave you with that, and thank you so much. It's really been my pleasure.